this, I call her, trying to move my zoom around, sorry. It's a critique and argument against psychologism, is the way that we can think about this. So here, if we wanted to, the view that intentions have to first and foremost be something in the head, and then we'll explain everything else after that. We'll call that view psychologism. And so we can think of Anscombe as attacking psychologism. So here is her way, a development of an example that she gives in the text for understanding why psychologism might be wrong. So let's start with this guy who's pumping over here, and we'll call him Pumper A. So what's this guy doing? It's a still photo, you can't see him, but he's moving his arms up and down. And when he moves his arms up and down, he operates the pump. And as he operates the pump, he replenishes the house water supply. Imagine that trough has got a pipe that then goes to the house water supply. But he doesn't like the people who are inside the house, and he's put some poison in there. And so he's going to deliberately poison the inhabitants. These are 4 different descriptions of what the guy is doing: moving his arms up and down, pumping the water, replenishing the house water supply, and trying to poison the inhabitants. So contrast this with this case where 1 to 3 are still the same. You got a guy moving a lever up and down, water's going into the house water supply, and it's got poison in it, but he doesn't know it's there. And so he poisons the inhabitants accidentally. Do Pumper A and Pumper B do the same thing? Again, in case 1, we've got inhabitants being poisoned. Case 2, they are, but Pumper B has no idea that that's what he's doing. We can imagine, to flesh out the example, he feels shame and horror when he discovers that that's what he was up to. All right, are these 2 guys doing the same thing? From a legal perspective, almost certainly not, right? There's a kind of a freedom from culpability that the ignorance of the situation will give to plausibly to the guy in the second situation. Maybe he's being negligent because he should know that poison is nearby, but whatever he's doing from a legal standpoint, he is not doing the same thing as the first guy who has deliberately set out a plan to kill some folks and then is employing the plan. So it seems like legally, it's very unlikely that in most familiar legal systems that these 2 cases would be treated the same. Morally, again, almost certainly not. In one case, we've got somebody who wants to kill some people, has set about a plan to killing them, and is taking the steps to bring it about. And in the other case, we've got somebody who intends no harm, thinks that they're doing good, and unbeknownst to them, are causing the death of many. So if we answer the question, are these guys doing the same thing from a legal or moral perspective, and just start with what we're intuitively inclined to say, I think that most of our intuitions will tend towards saying these are 2 different cases. But metaphysically, it's not so clear, right? It depends on what we mean by doing. And if we think that human action, for whatever reason, stops at the arms, well, they're moving their arms in exactly the same way. So maybe there is a sense in which they are doing exactly the same thing. But then again, maybe they're not, because what underwrites the legal and moral understanding is itself a metaphysical matter. We got some philosophy to do here in order to sort out how to think through the ontology of action and the metaphysics of what's going on in order to answer the moral and legal questions. And I'll say here, since I flagged Wittgenstein as the later Wittgenstein, along with the positivists, as great enemies of metaphysics, one way that Anscombe has been understood moving forward in the 20th century is using this ordinary language philosophy and turning it to topics like intention to find a new way of doing metaphysics, perhaps a pragmatist mode of engaging in metaphysics that doesn't involve methodologically the kind of gross speculation that is characteristic of the philosophical tradition, but uses the way we talk as a way of understanding distinctions that we can call metaphysical and not have to be perhaps ashamed of. Okay. Let's think some more about these pumpers and differences that might make a difference as to how we describe what they're doing. And let's think about the psychological and epistemic differences between the 2. Pumper A wants to poison the inhabitants, and he knows he is doing so, and Pumper B doesn't want to poison the inhabitants and does not know he is doing so. So psychologistic hypothesis that I want to advance is that this is a difference in intention between the two, and it is primarily a causal difference. So when we're describing the difference between the pumpers, what we're describing is a difference of what's going on in their minds, which again is the view that Anscombe wants to challenge, and that this thing that differs in their minds is a thing that has causal efficacy. It leads our bodies to do certain things. The phrase for this that one finds in the literature sometimes is that intentions are a spring for action. So what is different then and what matters for the legal and moral difference is the cause, the spring for action in the mind that sets the body in motion once the intention has been formed and it is time to execute it. Okay, so that's the target view. I've presented that as the psychologistic view that she wants to argue against. So how do we argue against this? What comes next is me developing a line of thought that one can find in intention. It draws on intention, but it's not exactly the way that Anscombe puts it. So I think the first step that we can take if we want to challenge what might seem like a very commonsensical picture for thinking about what intentions are is to do what I call the how many intentions argument. Now, Anscombe doesn't ask the how many intentions question, but she does ask how many actions this guy is performing. Is it one action? There's just one body moving and one series of events that flow through time. Or is it four? We described him in four different ways: moving his arms, moving the pump, replenishing the house water supply, and poisoning. Does that mean that there are four actions here and not one? Well, if it seems like there's four, it seems like there's probably an infinite number of things that he's doing. He's intentionally moving it this far, and then he's intentionally moving it this far, and he's intentionally moving it this far. This can go on for infinity. So maybe he's not performing one or four, but he's performing an infinite number. Or maybe infinity is too large, but maybe there's just a very, very large number of things that he's doing as he's moving the pump. Her answer is basically that this is that this question misformulates the way to think about the issue. What she says in response to this is that what we're really asking about are the descriptions that apply to what the man is doing, and that all action is action under a description. And the power of this idea and this phrase, I think, comes when you compare it to asking about if there's a room, how many cheetahs or how many chairs there are. Natural kinds like cheetahs and artifacts like chairs come in well-packaged entities that are easily individuated from one another so that we can count whether there's 2 cheetahs in the room or 4 chairs in the room. By saying that all actions are under a description, she's saying things that unfold through time, as opposed to concrete particulars like cheetahs or chairs, just aren't countable the same way that we count cheetahs and chairs. That when we ask the question, how many actions are there here, we're importing a sort of question that makes sense when we're talking about concrete particulars to a temporal phenomena where it just doesn't readily make sense. And that the key to understanding what makes action is that it is the descriptions that we bring the actions under, but that this mode of bringing goings-ons under descriptions then doesn't divide them up in any necessary way. There's varieties of ways in which we can carve up the temporal space in which action takes place. I think that there's a lesson there for thinking about if we wanted to ask the same question about intentions, in order to probe the psychologistic view. Does this guy have 1 intention? Does he have 4, an infinite number, a very large number? Well, it clearly can't be that he's got an infinite number of intentions because brains and minds are finite. So if it's not an infinite number of intentions that this guy has got, then there must be, at least in principle, some way to count the number of intentions that the pumper has, both in the example and in general. There must be some procedure that we could follow to get it inside his head and count the number that are there if there aren't an infinite number. But what are the individuation conditions of the intentions? What would we be looking for, even metaphorically, when we get in his mind, in the way that if you walk in a room and you're asked to count the chairs, you know exactly what to look for and where one chair stops and where another one begins. Skeptical gambit here is that any answer to this question, how do we individuate intentions, quasi-psychological items from one another, will be either arbitrary or question-begging or otherwise problematic. that the thought about trying to count the intentions in a person's mind when they perform an action leads to such confusion that we ought to see if there's another way of thinking about what intentions are, rather than imagining them to be individual and countable items in a person's mind. All right. Well, what else could we possibly do? Well, what would be the alternative? We stopped thinking about intentions as primarily psychological items. How else should we think about them? Well, here's some options. You could be an eliminativist. The behaviorists were eliminativist, and there are some modern philosophers of mind who were inspired by cognitive science to be eliminativist about intentions, which is just to say, I'm just going to throw intention as a category out of my scientific theory. I don't believe there are such things as intentions. The behaviorists said we shouldn't talk about them because you can't see them, basically. Modern cognitive scientists are like, man, when you look at what the brain works, it sure doesn't look at all like that anything that resembles what an intention in folk psychology is. So this is a skeptical conclusion. There just are no intentions. This is, I think, a similar kind of response that Hume has, a similar kind of move that Hume makes about causation, which is to eliminate talking about causes as the necessary phenomena that they're purported to be in science. And many people respond to Hume, I think, correctly by saying, well, good luck with that. That's not going to be of much use for making sense about how we do end up thinking about and talking about the world, just to like banish all talk of causation. And Hume himself, I think, is much more pragmatist than you might be led to believe by looking at the arguments against causation. So Hume might be like, yeah, well, good luck with that. I'm going to be a pragmatist along with you too. But I think that this is a kind of hopeless way of proceeding. And as I think we'll see, it would require broad skepticism about practical reasoning to try to do away with thinking about intentions at all. And that's a kind of skepticism that no one can live with. Another alternative is to be either a post or a neo-Cartesian dualist. Now, I put post or neo-Cartesian here because I think that to many, it might be surprising to see how much of contemporary psychology, which prides itself on being materialist and prides itself on not accepting the Cartesian divide between two kinds of substances, res cogitans and res extensa, is itself Cartesian in the way that it explains how things go on in the world. Even if its metaphysics are monistically physicalistic, there's only one kind of substance, there's just material, that's it, I think most modern psychologists would say. The dualistic structure of Cartesianism is preserved anyway in the way that the mechanistic way in which action is explained. There are sensory inputs, and then the computer mind does something, and then it spits out an output. But that output then is like a command or an instruction for the body to go move around. That input compute output process, the computer in the middle has been, from an explanatory perspective, dualistically separated off of the body that is taking the sense information in and then commanding the nerves to move about. So even if you think there are no souls, that the body and the mind and the soul and the spirit, it's all just matter and atoms, you can still, from an explanatory position, be a dualist if you think that that's the way to explain how action works. And that is in a way one of the key things that Anscombe seems to be wants to be repudiating here. So the other alternative is to get back to explaining the explanatory order of intention. Here are the three senses of intention again. And what Anscombe is going to do in thinking about action in order to explain how the mind works rather than the other way around is to start with 2 and 3, but really 3 in explaining how to think about intention, which is to think of intention first and foremost as a distinctive kind of reason. And here we get the last of Anscombe's heroes, who is Aristotle. And she gets her Aristotle through her Catholic upbringing in the Thomist tradition. But one of the things that Anscombe, I think, is responsible for the second half of the 20th century in English-speaking philosophy is making all kinds of aspects of Aristotle's psychology and epistemology, and then in turn his ethics, the centerpiece of philosophical discussion in a way that they had, at least in the English-speaking philosophy, become a little bit lost in the wake of utilitarianism. Okay, so what does it mean to take an Aristotelian approach to action, an Aristotelian approach to intention, as an alternative to the psychologistic approach? Where we start then is to start with practical reasoning and think about what practical reasoning is. Okay, so what is the goal of any bit of practical reasoning? According to Aristotle, it is getting or doing or bringing about what we think is good. Now, don't get hung up here on, he's not saying that we all always pursue what we believe is the best thing. He knows that we do things sometimes that act against our what we believe to be best. And he certainly doesn't think that we're all moral saints and we all know what the good is and we're all pursuing it. He thinks a lot of bad stuff happens too. The idea is just when you're doing something, you're doing it because you think some benefit is going to come from what you have done. Any kind of action that takes place is done in order for some benefit to come about. Often that benefit to you, maybe not to anyone else, but like something it's not worth spending your time doing anything if nothing good is going to come of it. That's kind of the basic idea here. Don't hear that in a moralistic key. All right, well, how does such reasoning go? Anscombe points out that this is Aristotle's own example for what practical reasoning looks like. Dry food suits any human. She remarks that it's a rather strange diet that they had back then. Such and such food is dry. So I've got the general thought that dry food is good, and then I see some food, and I'm like, oh, there's some dry food. Now, then I note that I am a human, so this dry food and me, we're gonna hook up in a way that could be good. And this, the such and such food is dry is that I know that what categories of foods fall under the broad genus of dry food. And now I see one of these kinds of food in front of me. Now, Aristotle draws the conclusion and says, this food suits me. And Anscombe makes a big deal out of the fact that in his own writing, he makes that out to be the conclusion of the practical reasoning. But that can't be all that's going on there, because if you just concluded this food suits me, you might sit inert and not do anything towards it. And so she points out that there are other ways in which Aristotle talks about practical reasoning, where it's pretty clear that what it means to bring the reasoning to a conclusion is to actually reach out, grab the food, and start eating it, to make the motions towards realizing the goodness that could be had from consuming this food that's good for the kind of being that I am. So note that the conclusion of this reasoning is an action itself. It's not just a mental state. It's actually doing something to bring about the good that the reasoning has determined would be good to bring about. What the point of the reasoning is not to figure out what would be a great mental state to get into. The point of the reasoning is to figure out what is worth doing in the world. So the reasoning itself, Aristotle is suggesting, and Anscombe thinks is the deep insight here, the reasoning itself is incomplete if it just stops with a mental state. You haven't gotten to the end of what the point of the reasoning was, which was to actually do something in the world. This, she reads Aristotle as thinking, is a key difference between practical reasoning on the one hand and scientific or theoretical reasoning on the latter. Scientific and theoretical reasoning aims at belief. Its goal is to understand what is true in the world, and the conclusion is a psychological state, namely a belief that you then carry around with you. Practical reasoning, on the other hand, aims at the good, and it doesn't end in a psychological state. It ends in actually doing something. So for practical reasoning then, so that's what practical reasoning is. A practical reason is just a step in the chain of reasoning that will lead to action. Okay, so Anscombe's gloss on what Aristotle is talking about here, she says that his notion of practical reasoning reveals the order that there is in the chaos of human action. The order in question of action is teleological. Humans do stuff when they do stuff, not accidentally because they trip or the wind blows them over or they sneeze, maybe when they sneeze, but definitely not when the wind blows them over, they trip. Humans do stuff, they perform actions in order to achieve goals. That's why we do stuff. So the order, the logic of action is teleological, it is goal-directed. She does not think that Aristotle thinks, and she is definitely not claiming that that means that all action is preceded with explicit active reasoning. Clearly not. Most of what we do in our life, we don't do by like stopping and performing a practical deduction and then going out and doing something. We just act most of the time. But if we do so and our action is intentional, this logic of goal-directedness will be implicit and present in the action itself. And that means that in the normal run of things, a person can say why they are doing what they are doing. Now, if you want to talk about in the Q&A what to say about subconscious or non-conscious or unconscious motives and intentions, we can talk about it. I think Anscombe's view is perfectly compatible with the view that, maybe begins with Freud, that a lot of the stuff we do, we don't know why we're doing it. that fact does not need to be in tension with the kind of logic that Anscombe is meaning to describe here. We'll come back to that in Q&A if that interests folks. I want to proceed on for now. So Anscombe thinks that in order to understand what an intention is, we don't start with psychology, but rather we start with logic. And the logic that we start with is not the logic of the deductive syllogism of theoretical reasoning, but rather practical logic, which is the order in which all action proceeds. And action proceeds teleologically as a series of means towards an ends. So when we call an action intentional, what we are saying is that the action belongs to this structure of a means to an ends. That's what makes action action, is that it has this logical structure of the steps being steps that reasonably are drawing the person towards the goal that they're pursuing. And if we want to understand what intention is, then we must first understand what intentional action is, that this is the proper order of explanation, to start with practical reasoning and practical logic, and then work back to an understanding about what might go on in the mind. All right, let's start tying these threads together, wrap this up, and get to Q&A. So how does this all pertain to what in her personal life was motivating her to think hard about this stuff at the time, which was Truman being potentially awarded I think he did get it after all, but the honorary doctorate at Oxford. All right, again, doctrine of double effect says if Truman intentionally did something that was morally permissible and it had predictably harmful consequences, he might not have done anything morally impermissible, depending upon all the rest of the circumstances. We have just, Anscombe thinks that she has shown in intention that intentional action is human activity that has the teleological order of practical reasoning, which we just talked about, means end reasoning. So when Truman dropped the bombs, the relevant question is, was the killing of innocent civilians a predictable side effect, or was it the means towards the desired end, that is making the Japanese surrender? Anscombe thinks it's pretty clear from the way things went that it was the means to the ends, based on where the bombs took place and what the objective of them was. And so since the means itself was part of the end of killing innocent civilians in order then to bring the war to an end, that means that the action falls under the description of murder precisely because of the structure that it involves. The key, this brings us back to the notion that we came across earlier when we thought about, are there one intentions, four intentions, a ton of intentions when the pumper is pumping? And Anscombe said that's the wrong question to ask. We don't count actions that way. All actions are just actions under the descriptions. If this is the logical structure of what took place, then the description murder applies. And Anscombe thinks that it's not a good thing for Oxford to be giving honorary degrees to murderers. Okay, last slide, and then we'll turn to Q&A. I put some of the legacy of intention because I think intention has got, the book itself has got quite a legacy, but here are the parts that I want to, two things I want to tease out that we've already discussed, and one that I would be remiss if I didn't mention, but we didn't have much to say about here. So the first thing I think that's part of intention's legacy is to show just how deeply Cartesianism runs in contemporary philosophy, even after substance dualism is rejected. I think one way of understanding this attack on the psychologistic account of intention, with the idea of thinking that in order to explain what intentions are, we start with the contents of a person's mind, is that that whole approach is still a holdover from the way that Descartes separated mind from body and then thought that philosophy could take place starting with the mind and then just work its way out to moving the body like a marionette operates a puppet or something like that, or a puppeteer operates a puppet. It's even better if it's a marionette operating puppet. To get out of this view, what we need to do is really return to Aristotle and the Aristotelian legacy, which means thinking about how the way that we think about the world and make decisions about what we do in the world is all part of our activity and action in the world, and that we cannot understand what the mind is up to. I'm sure both Anscombe and Aristotle think about this when thinking about belief, but especially in its practical guise, when we're thinking about action and then goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness of action. We can't just start at the mind and then work our way out to the body. the body acting with reason through space has got to be the starting point for thinking of any of this stuff. And she makes the case forcefully in Intention, and kicks off, again, a whole new way of doing philosophy of mind and epistemology and ethics that begins to recover what she thinks are lost insights from Aristotle that have been hiding behind the wake of Descartes for the better part of 300 years. Finally, I didn't say much about this in our discussion here, but she has an entire account of a kind of self-knowledge that she thinks is present in intentional action. It's the kind of self-knowledge that allows you to say when you're doing something, why you're doing it, that she calls non-observational knowledge. So part of her epistemological project is to say that another bad thing that Cartesianism has left us with is the idea that all self-knowledge would be viewing yourself from a third person perspective, as if you were viewing the mind of anyone else. And again, I think that this is deeply ingrained in the way that contemporary psychology proceeds. And it eliminates the very possibility of describing something that is commonplace in our own lives, which is the way that we know what we're doing when we're doing ordinary mundane things and can speak for ourselves about our reasons. There are entire sections devoted to explaining what non-observational knowledge is, which opened up a whole branch of epistemology that's just focused on those limited sections of the text. And it would take another hour to explain what that's all about. So I'll leave it at there, and I look forward to your questions.